Hello everyone, I am the Boring Historian, and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from, and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. In the shadows of medieval castles and behind the opulent tapestries of royal courts, the personal lives of Europe's monarchs often diverged dramatically from the divine right they claimed justified their rule. While official chronicles painted idealized portraits of righteous sovereigns, court gossip, private journals, and the accounts of disgruntled courtiers tell far different stories. These alternative narratives reveal monarchs whose sexual appetites and bizarre proclivities shocked even the relatively permissive standards of their times. This historical exposé aims to uncover the dark underbelly of medieval monarchy, examining verified accounts of royal sexual deviance across Europe and the Near East during the medieval period. From the Carolingian dynasty to the tumultuous courts of late medieval Europe, we will explore how the unlimited power wielded by these rulers often manifested an unlimited indulgence of their most base desires. Yet this is not merely a catalog of royal perversions. These stories reveal profound truths about the nature of absolute power, the hypocrisies of medieval society, and the complex interplay between public persona and private vice. Each monarch's tale is situated within their specific cultural, political, and religious context, illuminating how their sexual behavior intersected with broader dynamics of power, gender, and governance. The monarchs profiled in these pages were not merely colorful eccentrics. They were rulers whose personal conduct often had profound political consequences. Failed marriages led to wars, sexual scandals undermined dynasties, and royal perversions drained treasuries and alienated powerful nobles. In examining these intimate histories, we gain insight into how the medieval institution of monarchy functioned in practice, beyond the sanitized accounts of official chroniclers. Drawing on contemporary chronicles, court records, ecclesiastical documents, and the accounts of those who witnessed these rulers firsthand, this exposé aims to separate verified fact from salacious rumor, while acknowledging that the line between the two was often blurred by political motivations and medieval attitudes towards sexuality. What emerges is a complex portrait of medieval power at its most unbridled, and at times its most disturbing. Let us begin our journey through the bedchambers and private chambers of medieval Europe's most notorious monarchs, where the consequences of unchecked power often manifested in the most intimate aspects of human behavior. When Pope Leo III placed the imperial crown upon the head of Charles the Great, Charlemagne, on Christmas Day in the year 800, he was elevating a man already renowned throughout Europe for his military conquests and administrative reforms. As the first Holy Roman Emperor, Charlemagne would be remembered by history as the Father of Europe, a towering figure who united much of Western Europe under his rule and sparked a cultural and educational revival known as the Carolingian Renaissance. Yet behind this glorious public image lurked a man whose private appetites shocked even his contemporaries. Contemporary accounts describe a tall, robust ruler with piercing eyes and a commanding presence who held court from his capital at Aachen. There, amid the splendid palace complex he constructed, Charlemagne indulged desires that contradicted the Christian values he so zealously promoted throughout his empire. The king's appetites were as vast as his territories, wrote one Frankish chronicler who served in Charlemagne's court. In battle, in governance, and in the bedchamber, he knew no moderation. While medieval kings were generally expected to take mistresses, Charlemagne's sexual appetite exceeded even the generous standards of his era. Historical records confirm that he had at least 4 wives and 6 known concubines, though contemporary accounts suggest the actual number of women who shared the emperor's bed numbered in the dozens. Einhard, Charlemagne's loyal biographer, struggled to reconcile the emperor's sexual excesses with his otherwise admirable character. While praising the emperor's devotion to his children, he refused to let his daughters marry, reportedly because he could not bear to be separated from them. Einhard glosses over the less savory aspects of his master's private life. He was so careful of the education of his sons and daughters that he never dined without them when he was at home, and never traveled without them, Einhard wrote. What he did not mention was the widespread rumor that Charlemagne's refusal to allow his daughters to marry stemmed not merely from paternal affection, but from something more sinister. Court gossip, recorded in the margins of monastic chronicles and in private letters between nobles, suggested that Charlemagne kept his daughters close for his own pleasure. While these accusations of incest must be approached with caution, such charges were common political weapons in the early medieval period. The persistence of these rumors across multiple sources suggests they may have had some basis in fact. The most detailed accounts concern Charlemagne's relationship with his sister Gillen. Multiple contemporary sources report that the emperor engaged in an incestuous relationship with her that produced a son named Roland. While Roland's existence is historically verified, he would later become one of Charlemagne's most trusted military commanders, immortalized in the medieval epic The Song of Roland. His parentage remains a matter of historical controversy. What is not disputed is that Charlemagne later experienced profound guilt over his relationship with Gillen. Medieval chroniclers record that he made a pilgrimage to the tomb of St. Gilles near Nimes, where he prayed fervently for forgiveness. According to these accounts, an angel subsequently delivered a parchment declaring that God had forgiven the emperor on the condition that he never repeat his sin. While the angelic intervention clearly belongs to the realm of pious legend, historians give credence to the underlying story of the emperor's incestuous relationship and subsequent remorse. The specificity of the accounts, their appearance in multiple independent sources, and Charlemagne's documented visit to St. Gilles all lend weight to this unsavory aspect of the imperial biography. Even more disturbing than the allegations of incest are the persistent references in 9th century texts to an unspeakable sin that Charlemagne supposedly committed but long refused to confess. Several religious chronicles mention this mysterious transgression, describing how the emperor eventually revealed it to his confessor and performed elaborate penances to atone for it. Modern scholars analyzing these texts have concluded that the unnamed sin likely referred to necrophilia. The Latin phrases used to describe the emperor's transgression closely match terminology used in ecclesiastical documents, referring to sexual contact with corpses, a practice that was considered among the most abhorrent of sexual perversions in medieval Christian theology. One account from a monastery in Fulda states that the emperor was afflicted with a most unnatural desire, one so contrary to God's design that its name cannot be spoken among Christians. The chronicler continues, "Yet in his later years, he sought God's mercy for this terrible sin, wearing a hair shirt beneath his royal garments and observing strict fasts that none of his courtiers knew about." Legends that developed in subsequent centuries elaborated on these vague references, claiming that Charlemagne's necrophilia extended to sleeping with his wife's corpse after her death. While these later embellishments lack historical verification, they point to a persistent tradition linking the emperor to this particular perversion. Charlemagne's sexual excesses were not limited to private transgressions. His palace complex at Aachen included elaborate thermal baths modeled on Roman facilities, capable of accommodating up to 100 bathers. According to multiple contemporary accounts, the emperor regularly hosted raucous parties in these baths, where nobles, courtiers, and numerous women would join him in a state of complete nudity. The emperor delights in swimming and bathing in thermal waters, wrote a visiting Byzantine diplomat in a report to Constantinople. He has constructed at Aachen a pool so large that 50 men can swim in it at once. There, he often invites his friends and nobles to join him, and things occur in these waters that would scandalize even our most libertine citizens. Einhard reluctantly confirms these bathing parties, though he attempts to cast them in a more innocent light. He enjoyed the natural hot springs and frequently exercised by swimming, in which he was so skilled that no one could surpass him. For this reason, he built his palace at Aachen and lived there constantly during the last years of his life until his death. What Einhard omits is what multiple other sources verify, that these swimming sessions often evolved into sexual orgies where the emperor would demonstrate his legendary stamina with multiple partners, while courtiers were expected to participate or at least observe approvingly. The contradiction between Charlemagne's public championing of Christian morality and his private behavior represents one of the great hypocrisies of medieval rulership. As emperor, he promulgated strict laws against sexual immorality throughout his domains. His capitularies, legal pronouncements issued throughout his reign, prescribed harsh punishments for adultery, incest, and sexual misconduct by clergy. In the Admonitio Generalis of 789, Charlemagne ordered, "Let fornication and uncleanness of any kind not be named among you, as befits saints. Let no one dare to commit adultery or fornication, or to perpetrate any unlawful coupling." This same document threatened severe penalties for incest, defined as marriage or sexual relations within 7 degrees of kinship, a prohibition that Charlemagne himself flagrantly violated if the accounts of his relationship with his sister are accurate. The emperor's sexual excesses had political consequences as well. His refusal to allow his daughters to marry disrupted normal diplomatic channels in an era when royal marriages were crucial tools of alliance building. By keeping his daughters at court as companions and, if the darker rumors are true, as sexual partners, Charlemagne sacrificed important political advantages to serve his personal desires. How do we reconcile the brilliant statesman, military leader, and patron of learning with the man who allegedly committed some of the most taboo sexual acts recognized in medieval society? This contradiction lies at the heart of Charlemagne's complex legacy. The emperor's sexual behavior must be understood within the context of absolute power. As the most powerful man in Western Europe, Charlemagne faced few constraints on his behavior. Those who might have censured another man for sexual impropriety, the nobility or the church, were dependent on the emperor's favor and protection. Power reveals, as the historian Robert Caro has observed. In Charlemagne's case, the unlimited power he wielded revealed appetites and desires that would have remained checked in a man of lesser station. His sexual excesses represent the dark underside of the absolute authority he exercised over his vast domains. Yet despite these troubling aspects of his private life, Charlemagne's historical significance remains undiminished. The empire he built, the administrative systems he established, and the cultural revival he sponsored transformed medieval Europe and laid foundations that would influence European civilization for centuries to come. The complete man, brilliant strategist, capable administrator, patron of learning, and sexual deviant, reminds us that historical figures rarely conform to simple moral categories. In the complex character of Charlemagne, medieval Europe's most successful ruler, we see illustrated the full spectrum of human potential and human failing, elevated to imperial scale. When William Rufus ascended to the English throne in 1087, he stepped into the enormous shadow cast by his father, William the Conqueror. The second Norman king of England lacked his father's military genius and administrative skill, but in one respect, he outdid even the formidable conqueror: his capacity for scandalizing the religious establishment and shocking his contemporaries with his personal conduct. William Rufus, so called for his ruddy complexion and fiery temper, was a stark contrast to his pious elder brother Robert and his scholarly younger brother Henry. Contemporary chronicles describe him as stocky and powerful, with a shock of red hair and a face perpetually flushed from drinking or rage. Unlike his father, who maintained at least a public show of religious devotion, Rufus openly mocked the church, blasphemed against Christian teachings, and surrounded himself with companions whose behavior outraged ecclesiastical authorities. Never since the pagan kings has England seen a monarch with such contempt for holy things, wrote the monk Eadmer of Canterbury, whose chronicle provides one of our most detailed accounts of Rufus's reign. His court was filled with effeminate young men who grew their hair long like women, walked with mincing steps, and dressed in extravagant fashions that left parts of their bodies indecently exposed. The court of William Rufus became notorious throughout Europe for its licentiousness and depravity. The king surrounded himself with handsome young men who adopted outlandish fashions that scandalized religious observers. These courtiers wore tunics with sleeves so long they dragged on the ground, pointed shoes that curled up at the toes like ram's horns, and grew their hair long and flowing like women, a style that particularly infuriated the clergy, who considered short hair on men a mark of Christian modesty. Orderic Vitalis, a contemporary chronicler, wrote that these fashions were introduced by a courtier named Robert, who filled the court of the king with effeminate and sodomitical practices. According to Orderic, this Robert had been exiled from Normandy for seducing the son of a nobleman, only to find favor in the English court, where his proclivities were not merely tolerated, but celebrated. The king himself set the tone for this decadent atmosphere. William of Malmesbury reported that the king's chamber was a place where troops of pathics, passive homosexual partners, and catamites, young male prostitutes, freely disported themselves. While some of this language reflects the prejudices of clerical chroniclers, the consistency of these accounts across multiple sources suggests that Rufus's court was indeed a center for sexual behavior that defied the norms of medieval Christian society. Among William Rufus's closest companions was Ranulph Flambard, whom the king appointed as his chief minister. Described by contemporaries as a man of low birth but extraordinary ambition, Flambard was hated by the nobility and the church for his rapacious tax collection and his manipulation of ecclesiastical vacancies to increase royal revenue. Chronicles suggest that Flambard's relationship with the king went beyond the political, with Eadmer obliquely referring to unseemly intimacies between the two men. Even more notorious was the king's relationship with a courtier known as Thurston the Abuser, who reportedly procured young men for the king's pleasure. According to several chronicles, Thurston would travel throughout the kingdom seeking handsome youths from noble families who would be brought to court as hostages, pages, or squires, only to be initiated into what one monk described as the unspeakable customs of the king's private chamber. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, normally restrained in its language, hints at these activities when it states that In this king's days, all justice was in abeyance, and all unrighteousness arose. The chronicler continues. He oppressed the church, took the lands of bishops for his own use, and permitted his followers to commit acts against nature that Christian men should not even name. William Rufus's passion for hunting was legendary. He expanded the royal forests, imposed harsh penalties for poaching, and spent much of his time pursuing game in the extensive woodland he claimed as his exclusive domain. His creation of the New Forest in Hampshire involved the clearance of villages and churches, an act that his subjects viewed as sacrilegious, and that later chroniclers would cite as the reason for his untimely death in a hunting accident in those same woods. Behind this conventional royal pastime, however, lay darker purposes. Multiple sources suggest that the king's hunting expeditions served as covers for sexual assignations away from the prying eyes of the court. Secluded hunting lodges deep in the royal forests became sites for what one chronicler described as revels that would shame even the pagans of ancient Rome. A letter from Archbishop Anselm of Canterbury to the king, preserved in the cathedral archives, obliquely references these forest gatherings. It is reported to me by men of good faith that your highness conducts himself in the depths of the forest in a manner unbecoming to your royal dignity and contrary to God's law. I beseech you, for the salvation of your soul, to cease these practices and return to the path of righteousness. The king's response, if he made one, has not survived. What is clear from contemporary accounts is that the royal hunting parties included few of the older nobles and numerous young men, selected primarily for their physical appearance. One chronicle notes that those who accompanied the king into the deep woods were chosen not for their skill at arms or knowledge of the hunt, but for qualities more pleasing to the eye. Unlike most medieval monarchs, William Rufus never married, despite the urgent dynastic need to produce an heir to the Norman line. His celibacy regarding women was so complete that it became a subject of concern throughout the kingdom. The Anglo-Norman historian William of Malmesbury reported that he never desired to have a lawful wife, but was content with chance intercourse with women. This chance intercourse, however, appears to have been rare, if not entirely fictional. Other contemporaries were more direct about the king's sexual preferences. Eadmer wrote that the matter of the king's marriage was often raised by his counselors, but he would turn aside such discussions with jests, saying he had no need of a queen when he had so many pleasant companions already at his court. The monastic chronicler Hugh of Flavigny was even more explicit, writing that the English king abhors marriage and, like another Herod, sets a shameful example to his people. For rejecting the natural use of women, he gives himself over to acts that may not be spoken of in Christian company. This refusal to marry and produce heirs had serious political consequences. When William Rufus died childless in 1100, the succession immediately became contested between his brothers Robert and Henry, leading to years of instability and eventual civil war. His personal sexual preferences thus had direct implications for the political future of England and Normandy. Perhaps most shocking to his contemporaries was William Rufus's open contempt for Christian teaching and his alleged participation in rituals that inverted or mocked religious ceremonies. Multiple chroniclers report that the king regularly blasphemed, swearing by the holy face of Lucca, a reference to a venerated crucifix in Italy, whenever he was angry or wanted to emphasize a point. More disturbing were accounts of mock religious ceremonies conducted in the king's private chambers. According to one chronicle, written shortly after the king's death, Rufus and his companions would dress in robes resembling ecclesiastical vestments and perform parodies of the Mass, substituting obscene words for sacred phrases and incorporating sexual acts into the mockery. Orderic Vitalis reports that a knight once confronted the king about these activities, saying, "My lord king, you who rule over Normans, English, and many peoples, should set an example of honor and Christian conduct. Yet it is said throughout your realm that you scorn the sacraments and make sport of holy things." The king reportedly laughed off this criticism and continued his sacrilegious practices. Some historical sources even suggest that William Rufus dabbled in magical practices and demonic invocation. William of Malmesbury records a story in which the king, upon being urged to appoint a new Archbishop of Canterbury, responded, "By the holy face of Lucca, neither Anselm nor any other shall be Archbishop, but myself, and I shall be the Pope of England, as well as its king." While such accounts may reflect the bias of clerical chroniclers against a king who consistently defied and exploited the church, the volume and consistency of these reports suggest that Rufus did indeed engage in behavior that deliberately transgressed religious boundaries and shocked Christian sensibilities. The sudden and mysterious death of William Rufus in 1100 has been the subject of speculation for centuries. The official account states that the king was killed by an errant arrow while hunting in the New Forest, shot by a nobleman named Walter Tyrrell. Tyrrell immediately fled the country, suggesting to many historians that the accident may have been a carefully planned assassination. Contemporary chronicles noted the irony that Rufus died in the very forest he had created by dispossessing churches and villages. Many saw divine retribution in his death, with one monk writing that God's justice finally found him in the place where he had committed so many sins against the poor and against Holy Church. What these pious interpretations obscure, however, is the possibility that the king's death was connected to his sexual scandals. Several chroniclers hint that the hunting party on that fatal day included several young men who had been the subject of the king's attentions, as well as nobles who resented the king's sexual exploitation of their sons or younger brothers. A tantalizing entry in the Chronicle of Hugh of Flavigny suggests a more direct connection. Those who know the full circumstances of the king's death say that he was engaged in conversation of a most improper nature with certain young men when Sir Walter's arrow found its mark. Thus did God strike him down in the midst of his sin. Whether assassination or accident, William Rufus's death brought an immediate end to the sexual excesses that had characterized his court. His brother and successor, Henry Thirst, moved quickly to distance himself from his brother's reputation, dismissing the more notorious court favorites and making a politically advantageous marriage to Matilda of Scotland within months of taking the throne. The sexual proclivities of William Rufus present a challenge to historians. The primary sources, almost exclusively written by clerical chroniclers hostile to the king, must be approached with caution. The language used to describe the king's behavior is laden with religious prejudice and may exaggerate or distort the reality of his conduct. Yet the consistency of these accounts across multiple sources and the specific details they provide suggest that there was indeed something unusual and scandalous about William Rufus's sexual behavior by the standards of his time. His failure to marry, his court filled with effeminate young men, and the persistent rumors about activities in his private chambers and hunting lodges all point to a king whose sexuality defied the norms of medieval Christian kingship. More significant than the exact nature of his sexual activities is what the king's behavior reveals about the limits of royal power and the importance of sexual conformity in medieval monarchy. Despite his defiance of religious sexual norms, William Rufus was able to rule effectively for 13 years because of the immense power he wielded as king. Yet his behavior alienated important segments of society, particularly the church, and may have contributed to his violent death. The Red King's reign demonstrates that medieval kings could defy sexual norms to a remarkable extent, protected by their royal status from consequences that would have destroyed lesser men. At the same time, his story reveals that such defiance carried political risks and could undermine the very foundation of royal authority, which rested on an image of the king as an exemplar of Christian virtue and proper masculine conduct. In the final analysis, William Rufus stands as one of history's most fascinating examples of how sexual nonconformity could exist even at the highest levels of medieval society, and how the unlimited power of kingship could express itself in the most intimate aspects of a ruler's life. Philip IV of France, known as Philip the Fair for his striking good looks, presented a public image of austere piety and implacable justice. Tall, blonde, and imposingly handsome, he cultivated a remote, almost divine persona, rarely speaking in public and maintaining a rigid control over his facial expressions. Contemporary chroniclers describe him as a statue of a king rather than a king of flesh and blood. Behind this marble facade, however, lurked a man of complex and disturbing sexual appetites. The king who destroyed the Knights Templar, humiliated the papacy, and built France into Europe's most centralized state, harbored desires that would have shocked his subjects had they become widely known. The king presents himself as a model of Christian virtue, wrote one Italian diplomat in a confidential report to his masters in Florence. Yet those who serve in his private chambers tell a different tale altogether. There are rooms in the palace at Paris that few are permitted to enter, where the most Christian king indulges appetites that are neither Christian nor kingly. The most notorious scandal of Philip's reign involved not the king himself, but his daughters-in-law. In 1314, Philip's 3 daughters-in-law were accused of adultery in what became known as the Tour de Nesle, Tower of Nesle affair. According to official accounts, 2 of the princesses, Marguerite and Blanche, married to Philip's sons Louis and Charles, were caught in adulterous relationships with 2 Norman knights, the brothers Philippe and Gautier d'Aunay. The king ordered a ruthless investigation that led to public confessions by all parties. The knights were subjected to horrific torture, publicly castrated, flayed alive, and finally decapitated. Marguerite and Blanche were found guilty of adultery and sentenced to life imprisonment, with Marguerite eventually being murdered in her cell, possibly on the king's orders. What the official narrative obscured, however, was Philip's own involvement in the events leading up to the scandal. Several contemporary sources, including the Chronicle of Saint Denis, hint that the king had developed an unhealthy fascination with his daughters-in-law, particularly Marguerite, who was renowned for her beauty. A Venetian merchant present in Paris during this period wrote in his private diary, "It is whispered among those close to the court that the king himself had sought the affections of the Princess Marguerite, and that her rejection of his advances played no small part in the vigor with which he pursued her punishment." Other accounts suggest that Philip had installed his own spies in the Tower of Nesle, not merely to catch the princesses in adultery, but to observe their liaisons. One chronicler obliquely refers to devices installed in the walls of certain chambers by the king's master artificer, through which activities within might be observed unseen, an early form of voyeurism facilitated by medieval architecture. The Tower of Nesle affair had devastating consequences for the French royal family. All three of Philip's sons would rule and die in quick succession without producing male heirs, ending the direct Capetian line and leading to the succession crisis that helped trigger the 100 Years' War. Some contemporary observers saw divine punishment in this dynastic catastrophe, connecting it directly to the sexual scandals and brutal executions ordered by Philip. Philip's court was notable for the presence of officials whose official duties appeared to extend into facilitating the king's private pleasures. Chief among these was Guillaume de Nogaret, the king's keeper of the seals, who orchestrated the attack on Pope Boniface VIII at Anagni and the prosecution of the Templars. While these public actions served Philip's political and financial interests, several contemporary sources suggest that Nogaret also procured women, and occasionally men, for the king's private entertainment. The chronicler Jean de Venette, writing several decades after Philip's death, claimed that Nogaret served the king in ways that went beyond matters of state, bringing to the royal bedchamber those who might please his master's eye, whether high-born or low, willing or not. While de Venette's account must be treated with caution due to its temporal distance from the events described, it aligns with hints in other contemporary sources about Nogaret's wider role in the king's household. More specific are references in the royal household accounts to payments made to young women from northern France and Flanders who were brought to Paris for unspecified services. These payments, authorized by Nogaret, were disguised as compensation for linens or services to the royal wardrobe, but their irregular pattern and the subsequent gifting of jewelry to the same women suggest a different purpose. Particularly disturbing are indications that not all of these encounters were consensual. In 1307, the same year Philip ordered the arrest of the Templars, the provost of Paris investigated the disappearance of several young women from the city's northern districts. The investigation was suddenly halted by royal command, with the provost receiving a substantial payment for his discretion in matters touching the king's honor. Perhaps the most shocking aspect of Philip's sexuality was his apparent eroticization of religious imagery and sacred objects. The king, who presented himself as a paragon of Christian virtue and who ruthlessly persecuted heretics, seems to have privately engaged in acts that bordered on sacrilege. The inventory of Philip's private chambers, conducted after his death in 1314, lists several items that raised eyebrows among those few officials permitted to view it. These included a bedchamber crucifix adorned with devices of an unseemly nature, and certain images of the Blessed Virgin altered in a manner most improper and contrary to holy teaching. A Dominican friar, who briefly served as one of Philip's confessors, later wrote a carefully coded account of the king's sins that has been preserved in the monastery archives at Lyon. Without explicitly describing the king's actions, the confessor refers to acts involving sacred objects that constitute grave sacrilege, and the misuse of holy images for fleshly gratification. These veiled references align with rumors that circulated after Philip's death about his private religious practices. According to these accounts, the king possessed a collection of religious statues, particularly of female saints and the Virgin Mary, that had been modified to incorporate openings and devices that served sexual rather than devotional purposes. While such accounts may have been exaggerated or even fabricated by Philip's enemies, particularly those sympathetic to the destroyed Templars, they appear in enough independent sources to suggest that the king's relationship with religious imagery involved elements that transgressed medieval boundaries between the sacred and the sexual. The king's most infamous act, the destruction of the Knights Templar, has been interpreted by some historians as having sexual dimensions beyond the official accusations of heresy and sodomy leveled against the order. Philip's relentless pursuit of the Templars, his insistence on charges of sexual perversion, and his personal supervision of interrogations suggest a fixation that went beyond political or financial motives. The records of Templar interrogations reveal a king unusually interested in extracting confessions of sexual misconduct. Philip personally attended some of the questioning sessions, where Templars were tortured into confessing that they kissed each other's posteriors, denied Christ, and engaged in homosexual acts as part of their initiation ceremonies. A Florentine banker present in Paris during the Templar trials wrote to his associates, "The king shows an unnatural eagerness for details of what he calls the Templars' depravities, demanding that confessions be read to him in full, particularly those parts describing acts between men that decent Christians would not speak of." Some contemporary observers even suggested that Philip's persecution of the Templars stemmed from his own rejection by the order. According to these accounts, the king had sought admission to the Templars as an honorary member, a common practice for European royalty with other military orders, but had been refused, possibly because the Templar leadership had become aware of his private conduct. While such theories remain speculative, what is clear from historical records is that Philip displayed an unusual personal investment in establishing the sexual guilt of the Templars, going far beyond what was necessary to achieve his political and financial objectives in destroying the order. As Philip aged, his sexual behavior reportedly took on increasingly disturbed dimensions. After the death of his queen, Joan I of Navarre, in 1305, the king never remarried, contrary to normal royal practice. Instead, according to several contemporary sources, he began to exhibit necrophilic tendencies that alarmed those closest to him. The most explicit account comes from an anonymous manuscript discovered in the archives of the Abbey of Saint Denis, where Philip was eventually buried. Written by someone with apparent first-hand knowledge of the royal household, it describes how, in his final years, the king commanded that certain corpses of young women recently deceased be brought in secret to a chamber deep within the palace, where he would spend hours alone with them, engaged in acts that nature and God forbid. While this document's authenticity has been questioned by some historians, its details align with more oblique references in other sources. The Chronicle of Saint Denis notes that in the last years of his reign, Philip developed strange customs regarding the recently departed, contrary to Christian teaching on the proper treatment of the dead. Similarly, papal correspondence from the period includes a carefully worded inquiry about rumors concerning the French king's unorthodox practices regarding the deceased. Philip's possible necrophilia may have had religious dimensions as well. Medieval Catholicism placed great emphasis on the incorruptibility of saints' bodies, and the king's collection of relics was famous throughout Europe. Some accounts suggest that Philip's fascination with the preserved remains of female saints may have crossed the boundary from devotion to perversion. A visiting cardinal wrote to Pope Clement V in 1311, "The most Christian king shows an unseemly interest in certain relics, particularly those of female saints, requesting privacy in their veneration that exceeds the bounds of proper devotion. I hesitate to commit my full concerns to writing, but I believe the Holy Father should be aware of these practices." Philip IV died suddenly in 1314 at the age of 46, following a stroke suffered while hunting. His death came less than a year after the execution of Jacques de Molay, the last Grand Master of the Templars, who according to legend had cursed both the king and Pope Clement V from the stake, summoning them to meet him before God's judgment seat within a year. Both men indeed died within the predicted time frame, contributing to the legend of the Templars' curse. In death, Philip was immediately transformed into the marble ideal he had cultivated in life. Official chronicles praised his justice, piety, and commitment to strengthening the French monarchy. The darker aspects of his reign, the brutal taxation, the manipulation of currency, the destruction of the Templars, and certainly his private sexual conduct, were either minimized or omitted entirely from these accounts. Yet alternative narratives persisted in private correspondence, unofficial chronicles, and oral tradition. These accounts presented a very different Philip: cold, cruel, sexually deviant, and sacrilegious. A popular rhyme that circulated after his death captured this dual legacy. The fair of face, the foul of heart, in public, God's most faithful son, in private chambers, Satan's art, the kingdom stands, the king undone. The historical Philip IV likely falls somewhere between these extremes. His reign undeniably strengthened the French monarchy and laid foundations for the modern French state. His legal reforms, administrative innovations, and assertion of royal authority over competing powers transformed medieval governance in ways that would influence European political development for centuries. Yet the evidence for his disturbing private conduct, while sometimes circumstantial and certainly colored by the biases of contemporary chroniclers, is too substantial to dismiss entirely. The Fair King's story illustrates how completely a medieval monarch could compartmentalize his public and private lives, maintaining an image of sacred kingship while indulging desires that violated the very religious principles he publicly championed. Philip's sexual deviance, if the accounts are accurate, also demonstrates the psychological effects of unlimited power. The king who could destroy the Templars, humble the papacy, and order executions without meaningful constraint was similarly unfettered in pursuing his most transgressive desires. In the person of Philip IV, we see how absolute power could corrupt absolutely even the most outwardly perfect embodiment of medieval kingship. When Pedro first ascended to the Castilian throne in 1350 at the age of 15, few could have predicted the reign of terror and sexual excess that would earn him the sobriquet the Cruel from his enemies, and, more tellingly, the Just from his supporters. Dark-haired, of medium height, and possessed of a nervous energy that made him seem perpetually in motion, Pedro I would rule Castile for 19 years in a manner that scandalized his contemporaries and created a legacy of controversy that persists to the present day. The king was fair of face, but foul of deed, wrote the chronicler Pedro López de Ayala, who served in Pedro's court before defecting to his half-brother and rival, Henry of Trastamara. He delighted equally in the shedding of blood and the bedding of women, often combining these pleasures in ways that Christian men should not speak of. While López de Ayala's account must be treated with caution due to his political allegiance to Pedro's enemies, numerous other contemporary sources confirm the king's twin appetites for violence and carnal pleasure. What emerges from these accounts is a portrait of a ruler whose sexual behavior was inextricably linked to his exercise of power and his notorious cruelty. Pedro's most famous relationship was with Maria de Padilla, a noblewoman of modest birth who became his mistress around 1352. Their passionate affair began shortly after Pedro's political marriage to Blanche of Bourbon, a French princess who arrived in Castile to seal an alliance between the two kingdoms. According to contemporary chronicles, Pedro abandoned his new bride 3 days after their wedding, returning to Maria's arms and leaving Blanche isolated in a foreign court. The chronicler Jean Froissart drawing on eyewitness accounts, described the young king's behavior. No sooner had the marriage been solemnized and the princess brought to bed than the king left her in the morning and returned to his mistress, Dona Maria, whom he loved more fiercely than any man has loved a woman in our time. What made this abandonment particularly shocking by medieval standards was Pedro's treatment of Blanche thereafter. Rather than maintaining the political marriage while discreetly continuing his relationship with Maria, a common practice among medieval monarchs, Pedro had Blanche imprisoned in the Alcazar of Toledo. Over the next 8 years, he moved her from fortress to fortress, subjecting her to increasingly harsh conditions, while publicly flaunting his relationship with Maria. Froissart's chronicle records rumors that circulated throughout Europe about the reasons for Pedro's hatred of his queen. Some said that the king had been bewitched by Dona Maria, who had given him certain herbs that made him unable to look upon the queen without horror. Others claimed that on their wedding night, the queen had refused some unnatural act that the king had demanded, and that this refusal had turned his desire to loathing. In 1361, Blanche died in captivity at Medina Sidonia, aged just 25. While the official cause was given as natural illness, contemporary accounts strongly suggested poisoning on Pedro's orders. López de Ayala stated directly, "The king commanded that the queen be given poison, which was administered to her by a physician of the king's household." The French royal family certainly believed this account, and Blanche's death contributed significantly to Pedro's reputation for cruelty throughout Europe. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Pedro's sexuality was his use of rape and sexual humiliation as weapons against his political enemies. Multiple contemporary sources document cases where the king sexually assaulted the wives, daughters, or sisters of nobles who had opposed him, often forcing the men to watch these violations before executing them. In 1358, after suppressing a rebellion led by several Castilian nobles, Pedro ordered a celebratory banquet in Seville, where the wives and daughters of the defeated rebels were forced to serve naked. According to López de Ayala, the king selected the most beautiful among them for his own pleasure that night, distributing the others among his most loyal captains, all while the heads of their husbands and fathers adorned the walls of the banquet hall. While such accounts may contain elements of exaggeration intended to blacken Pedro's reputation, they appear consistently across multiple sources, including chronicles produced outside Castile that had no obvious political motivation to defame the king. A Navarrese diplomat reported to his king that the Castilian monarch uses women's bodies as his instruments of revenge, inflicting dishonor before death in a manner more befitting a Moorish pirate than a Christian king. The pattern of sexual violence extended to the clergy as well. When the Archbishop of Toledo criticized the king's treatment of Queen Blanche, Pedro reportedly had the prelate's niece, a nun, abducted from her convent and brought to court, where she was repeatedly raped by the king and his companions before being returned to the convent. The message to the archbishop was clear. Not even the church could shield women from the king's vengeance. Beyond Maria de Padilla, Pedro maintained a rotating collection of mistresses, drawn from both the nobility and common classes. The royal palaces in Seville and Toledo contained special quarters for these women, described by one Italian visitor as arranged in the Moorish fashion, with many chambers opening onto a central courtyard where fountains play and musicians perform throughout the day and night. Unlike most Christian monarchs of his era, who at least maintained the pretense of monogamous relationships with their mistresses, Pedro openly embraced a harem-like arrangement more typical of Muslim rulers. This practice reflected both the strong Moorish influence on Castilian culture and Pedro's own rejection of Christian sexual norms. A particularly scandalous aspect of this arrangement was the king's habit of recruiting women who were already married or betrothed. The chronicler Matteo Villani reported that when the king hears of a beautiful woman in his kingdom, he sends his agents to assess her charms, and if she pleases him, he takes her for his collection, regardless of her prior commitments or her own wishes in the matter. In one notorious case, Pedro became enamored with Aldonza Coronel, the wife of one of his own officials. After having the husband sent on a diplomatic mission to France, the king had Aldonza brought to the Alcazar in Seville. When she resisted his advances, he reportedly kept her in increasingly harsh captivity until she yielded to his demands, only to lose interest in her shortly thereafter and return her, dishonored, to her husband. The cumulative effect of these actions was to create an atmosphere of sexual terror among the Castilian nobility. No man could consider his wife or daughters safe from the king's appetites, a situation that contributed significantly to the growing opposition to Pedro's rule and the eventual civil war that would end his reign. Contemporary accounts suggest that Pedro derived sexual pleasure not just from the act of intercourse, but from domination, humiliation, and the infliction of pain. Lopez de Ayala reports that the king was most aroused by the tears and pleas of unwilling women, and that he sometimes preferred to watch his companions rape a woman rather than engaging in the act himself. This voyeuristic tendency extended to public executions as well. Under Pedro's rule, executions became elaborate spectacles, often scheduled to coincide with festivals or other public gatherings. The king typically attended these events in person, seated on an elevated platform, with Maria de Padilla or another favored mistress by his side. Several sources report that Pedro and his companions would retire for sexual activities immediately following these bloody spectacles, suggesting a direct connection between witnessing violence and sexual arousal. A Genoese merchant present in Seville during this period wrote that, after the killing of certain nobles in the public square, the king was observed to leave in great haste with his mistress, both in a state of visible excitement, retiring to the palace, where none dared disturb them for many hours. Perhaps the most extreme example of this connection between sexuality and violence occurred in 1369, during the final stages of the civil war between Pedro and his half-brother Henry. After capturing the town of Burgos, Pedro ordered the execution of 16 supporters of Henry's cause. According to multiple chronicles, he arranged for these executions to take place in a specially constructed chamber within the castle, where he watched the killings while engaged in sexual activity with two captive noblewomen related to the condemned men. Pedro's sexual appetites reportedly extended to members of his own family, particularly his half-sisters. While these accounts must be treated with particular caution, as accusations of incest were a common political weapon in medieval character assassination, they appear in enough independent sources to suggest some basis in fact. Most specific are the allegations concerning Pedro's relationship with his half-sister Isabel, the daughter of Alfonso V, and Eleanor of Guzman. After executing Eleanor and Thurtro initially imprisoned her children, including Isabel. By 1355, however, Isabel had been brought to court and, according to Lopez de Ayala, shared the king's bed as though she were his wife, a sin against nature and against God's holy law. A Portuguese chronicle offers a slightly different account, suggesting that the relationship began as forced rather than consensual. The king took his father's daughter by violence, keeping her thereafter in a tower of the Alcazar, where she lived neither as princess nor prisoner, but as an object for the king's unnatural desires. Whether consensual or coerced, this relationship reportedly produced at least one child, though accounts differ as to the fate of this offspring. Some chronicles suggest the infant was killed immediately after birth to conceal the evidence of incest, while others claim it was raised in secret within the royal household, its true parentage known only to a few trusted servants. Bookmark: IBJ Khufu, The Death of the Cruel King. Pedro's reign of terror and sexual excess came to a violent end in 1369, when he was defeated and killed by his half-brother, Henry of Trastamara, at the Battle of Montiel. The manner of his death became legendary. Trapped in Henry's tent after being lured there under false pretenses of negotiation, Pedro grappled physically with his half-brother. According to the most widely accepted account, the two men fell to the ground in their struggle, with Henry underneath. One of Henry's knights, Bertrand du Guesclin, supposedly intervened with the words, "I neither put him up nor put him down, but I will help my master," turning the brothers so that Henry was on top. Henry then stabbed Pedro to death. This ignoble end seemed fitting to many of Pedro's contemporaries, who viewed his death as divine punishment for his cruelty and sexual depravity. Pope Urban IV, upon hearing the news, reportedly remarked that the Lord has delivered the people of Castile from a tyrant whose sins cried out to heaven for vengeance. The new king, Henry VI, immediately set about rewriting the narrative of Pedro's reign, commissioning chronicles that emphasized his cruelty and sexual excesses while minimizing his achievements. This propaganda campaign was so successful that for centuries, the historical Pedro was largely indistinguishable from the monstrous caricature created by his enemies. Modern historians have attempted to provide a more balanced assessment of Pedro I, acknowledging both his genuine cruelty and the political context that partly explains, if not excuses, his actions. His reign coincided with the Black Death, economic crises, and complex power struggles between the monarchy, nobility, and neighboring kingdoms, all factors that contributed to the violence that characterized his rule. Some scholars have noted that Pedro's sexual behavior, while extreme, reflected certain aspects of Castilian royal tradition. His father, Alfonso the Leste, had openly maintained a decades-long relationship with Eleanor of Guzman, producing 10 illegitimate children while largely ignoring his queen. The difference lay not in the fact of royal infidelity, but in Pedro's more flagrant disregard for the dignity of his legal wife and the violent sexual opportunism he displayed toward the women of his kingdom. What remains undisputed is that Pedro's sexual conduct was inextricably linked to his exercise of power. For the cruel king, sex was not merely a matter of personal pleasure, but an instrument of domination, revenge, and political control. In his reign, we see perhaps the clearest historical example of how unlimited royal authority could express itself through sexual violence when wielded by a monarch of sadistic temperament. Pedro's legacy serves as a stark reminder that medieval kingship, for all its theoretical grounding in Christian principles and chivalric ideals, could in practice enable the worst excesses of human behavior when constitutional constraints were absent and personal appetites ran unchecked. Bookmark: Urfu, the Papal Prince. While not technically a king, Pope John XII ruled as a temporal sovereign over the Papal States and wielded influence comparable to any European monarch of his time. His inclusion in this chronicle is justified not merely by his political power, but by the extraordinary nature of his sexual excesses, which scandalized even the relatively permissive society of 10th century Rome. Born Octavian, the only son of Alberic II, Prince of Rome, He was elevated to the papacy in 955 at the astonishingly young age of 18. This elevation had nothing to do with spiritual qualifications and everything to do with political calculation. Alberic, on his deathbed, had extracted promises from the Roman nobles to elect his son as the next pope, thereby ensuring the continuity of his family's control over Rome. The young pontiff retained his birth name, Octavian, for secular affairs while taking the name John XII for his ecclesiastical role, a dual identity that perfectly symbolized the conflicted nature of his reign. Contemporary descriptions portray him as handsome and charismatic, with a commanding presence that belied his youth. One Byzantine envoy described him as fair of face and form, with eyes that flash like jewels and a manner that would better suit an emperor's court than a bishop's palace. From the beginning of his pontificate, John showed little interest in spiritual matters and enormous enthusiasm for the privileges his position afforded him. The Liber Pontificalis, a collection of papal biographies, notes with palpable disapproval that he spent his days in hunting and his nights in revelry with young men and women, living more like a prince of pagans than the pontiff of Christians. Bookmark PFD Jur. The Lateran Palace as brothel. John the Thelan's most notorious innovation was his transformation of the sacred Lateran Palace, the official papal residence, into what contemporary chronicles described as a brothel. According to multiple accounts from both his enemies and more neutral observers, the young pope filled the palace with courtesans, female prostitutes, and handsome young men who served his varied sexual appetites. The historian Liutprand of Cremona, who attended a synod in Rome during John's pontificate, wrote a scathing account of the papal court. The Lateran Palace, once the dwelling place of saints, had become a harlot's den. Women feared to come to Rome in pilgrimage lest they be forced to serve the Pope's lust, as had happened to many. Particularly shocking to medieval sensibilities was John's reported habit of drinking toasts to pagan deities during sexual orgies held within the palace. Liutprand claims to have spoken with multiple witnesses who attested that the Pope, in the midst of his carnal pleasures, would raise his cup and invoke Venus and Jupiter, mocking the faith he was appointed to defend. While Liutprand's account must be approached with some caution, he was allied with the Holy Roman Emperor Otto I, who would eventually turn against John. Similar descriptions appear in other contemporary sources. A monk from Monte Cassino wrote that the successor of St. Peter has made his holy office a mockery, turning the house of prayer into a den of fornication where sacred vessels are used for profane feasting. Bookmark 9's Bim, the Pope's women. John's sexual partners reportedly included women from all social classes, from Roman noble women to peasant girls and professional prostitutes. Contemporary accounts claim that he maintained a virtual harem within the Lateran Palace, with a regular rotation of women brought in to satisfy his apparently insatiable appetites. One of the most serious accusations leveled against John concerned his relationship with his father's former mistress, referred to in some documents as the Elder Stephania. According to these accounts, John began a sexual relationship with this woman shortly after his father's death, effectively taking his father's concubine as his own, a practice considered incestuous under church law of the period. Even more scandalous were reports of John's habit of molesting female pilgrims who came to Rome seeking blessings or indulgences. The Chronicle of Benedict of Soracte states that women dared not come to the tombs of the martyrs if they were young or fair of face, for the Pope's agents watched the roads and seized those who might please their master's eye. According to Liutprand, John showed particular interest in married women and widows of high status. He violated women who came to the apostolic threshold to pray, wives of his father's nobles, and even widows of his kinsmen, using the sacred palace as a harlot's chamber. This predilection for married women and widows was especially transgressive in a society where female sexual honor was closely tied to family status and male authority. Bookmark Q7UK3BP. Homosexual activities. John's sexual interests apparently extended to men as well as women. Several contemporary sources refer to the Pope's sexual relationships with young men, particularly those in his immediate service. Liutprand of Cremona claims that he ordained a deacon in a stable and made bishops in exchange for gold or the satisfaction of his unnatural desires. The Annals of Fulda, compiled in Germany during this period, states more explicitly that the Holy Father kept handsome youths in his bed, using them as women are used by men, a sin crying to heaven that the vicar of Christ should so debase himself in his holy office. These accounts of homosexual behavior must be understood within their historical context. In medieval Christian theology, homosexual acts were considered among the most serious of sexual sins, crimes against nature that violated divine law and natural order. For a pope to engage in such behavior represented the ultimate subversion of his sacred role as defender and exemplar of Christian morality. While some historians have questioned the reliability of these accounts, suggesting they may have been exaggerated or fabricated by John's political enemies, the consistency of these reports across multiple sources suggests that there was likely some factual basis to the allegations. At minimum, John's behavior was sufficiently scandalous by contemporary standards to make such accusations credible to his contemporaries. Bookmark: Incest in Sacred Spaces. Perhaps the most shocking accusations against John XII concerned incest and the desecration of sacred spaces. Multiple contemporary sources claim that the Pope engaged in sexual relationships with his sisters and other close female relatives, violating both secular and canonical prohibitions against incestuous unions. Liutprand of Cremona's account is particularly explicit. He violated his father's concubine, consecrated virgins, and women who were his own blood relations. He turned the sacred palace into a brothel, where his own sister lay with him as though she were his wife, while their other sister was similarly abused. Even more transgressive was John's alleged habit of having sexual encounters within sacred spaces of the Lateran complex and other Roman churches. According to the Chronicle of Monte Cassino, the Pope did not shrink from committing adultery in the very church of St. Peter, Prince of Apostles, over the bodies of the holy martyrs, turning the house of prayer into a den of thieves and fornicators. Another account claims that John and his lovers engaged in sexual activities directly on the high altar of the Lateran Basilica, an act that represented the ultimate sacrilege in medieval religious understanding. While such claims may have been exaggerated by his enemies, they reflect the general perception of John as a pope who recognized no boundaries, sacred or profane, in the pursuit of his desires. Bookmark: Oic, Violence and Vengeance. John's sexual appetites were matched by his capacity for violence, particularly against those who resisted his advances or criticized his conduct. Several contemporary sources report that the Pope had men castrated or murdered for refusing to participate in his sexual activities or for protecting women he desired. According to Liutprand, a certain Cardinal John lost his nose and 2 fingers of his right hand for speaking against the Pope's debaucheries, while a subdeacon was strangled in the papal bedchamber for no crime but that of witnessing what should not have been seen. Particularly notorious was the case of a Roman nobleman named Crescentius, who reportedly objected when the Pope demanded sexual access to his wife. According to multiple chronicles, John had Crescentius blinded and castrated before having him dragged through the streets of Rome as a warning to others who might interfere with his desires. This combination of sexual rapacity and ruthless violence created an atmosphere of terror in Rome during John's pontificate. The annals of Ravenna record that no honest woman felt safe in the Holy City, and no man dared protect his wife or daughter against the Pope's lust, lest he suffer mutilation or death. Bookmark of 1. Downfall and Death. John the Theod's reign of sexual terror finally met resistance in 963, when he foolishly invited the German king Otto I to Rome to be crowned Holy Roman Emperor. Initially, the alliance seemed advantageous to both men. Otto received the imperial crown, while John gained a powerful protector against his Italian enemies. However, once Otto departed Rome, John betrayed their agreement by allying himself with Otto's enemies. The emperor returned to Rome in fury, and John fled the city. In his absence, Otto convened a synod of bishops that formally deposed John on charges that included murder, perjury, sacrilege, and sexual immorality. The list of accusations presented at this synod, recorded by Liutprand, who was present, provides the most comprehensive catalog of John's alleged crimes. He has had sexual relations with his father's concubine, with his own niece, and with many other women. He has turned the sacred palace into a brothel. He has blinded his spiritual father Benedict. He has castrated a cardinal, and afterward caused his death. He has set houses on fire. He has appeared in public wearing armor and sword, neglecting his spiritual duties. He has drunk toasts to the devil. While playing dice, he has invoked the help of Jupiter, Venus, and other demons. He has not celebrated matins or canonical hours, nor made the sign of the cross. A new pope, Leo VIII, was elected in John's place, but the story was not yet over. When Otto left Rome again, John's supporters drove out Leo, and John returned to the city. His revenge against those who had testified against him was swift and brutal. According to Liutprand, he cut off the right hand of Cardinal John the Deacon, who had written the invitation to Otto. From another, he cut off the tongue, nose, and 2 fingers. A third he had flogged naked through the streets of Rome until he died. John's restored pontificate would be brief. In May 964, according to the most widely accepted account, he died suddenly while in bed with a married woman. The Chronicle of Benedict of Soracht states bluntly, he was struck by the devil while in the act of adultery and died 8 days later without receiving communion. A more colorful version, recorded by Liutprand, claims John was caught in bed with a married woman by her husband, who beat the Pope so severely about the temples that he died from his injuries. This account concludes with the observation that, thus did God deliver his church from one who had defiled the Holy See with his abominations. Bookmark. Historical context and legacy. While John the Teuton stands out for the extremity of his sexual conduct, his behavior must be understood within the context of the so-called Dark Age of the Papacy, roughly 900 to 1150, when the papal office was largely controlled by powerful Roman families, who viewed it primarily as a source of wealth and influence rather than spiritual authority. During this period, several popes led scandalous personal lives, fathered children, and used church resources to enrich themselves and their families. What distinguished John the XII was not the mere fact of his sexual activity, but its extraordinary scope, variety, and public nature, as well as his flagrant desecration of sacred spaces and objects. John's pontificate had lasting consequences for the institution of the papacy. The scandal of his reign contributed significantly to the movement for church reform that would culminate in the Gregorian reforms of the 11th century, which sought to purify the church hierarchy and establish clearer separation between clerical and secular authority. In a broader sense, the story of John XII illustrates how completely the reality of medieval power could diverge from its theoretical foundations. As Vicar of Christ and successor to St. Peter, the Pope was supposed to embody the highest standards of Christian virtue. John's transformation of the papacy into an instrument for the satisfaction of his personal desires represents perhaps the most extreme case of the corruption of sacred authority in medieval European history. The lasting historical judgment on John XII was perhaps best summarized by Cardinal Baronius, the great Catholic historian of the 16th century, who wrote in his Ecclesiastical Annals, "The Holy See suffered its greatest disgrace when John XII sat upon the throne of Peter. His life was so evil, so foul, so execrable, that I shudder to relate it." Bookmark PTFPV, the Usurper King. When Sancho IV seized the Castilian throne in 1284, defying his father Alfonso X's wishes and displacing his own nephews who had stronger legal claims, he established a pattern of ruthlessness that would characterize both his reign and his personal conduct. Known as El Bravo, the Fierce, Sancho combined military prowess and political cunning with a temperament so violent that even hardened medieval nobles found it disturbing. Contemporary chroniclers described Sancho as powerfully built, with a florid complexion and reddish beard that seemed to accentuate his frequent rages. The Crónica de Sancho IV notes that his countenance was terrible to behold when anger took him, and all who served him lived in fear of his sudden furies, which could be kindled by the smallest matter. Behind the public face of the warrior king lay a private life marked by sexual violence, perversion, and a particular fixation on domination that extended from the battlefield to the bedchamber. While Sancho maintained a politically advantageous marriage to Maria de Molina, who bore him 7 children and skillfully managed the kingdom during his frequent military campaigns, his sexual activities beyond the royal marriage revealed a disturbing pattern of behavior that shocked even the relatively permissive standards of medieval Castile. Bookmark the King Pliny. One of Sancho's first acts upon seizing power was to establish what contemporary sources called casas de placer, pleasure houses, in several royal residences across Castile. These establishments, maintained at considerable expense from the royal treasury, functioned essentially as private brothels where the king could indulge his sexual appetites away from the court and his formidable queen. The most notorious of these pleasure houses was located in Seville, in a former Almohad palace that Sancho had renovated specifically for his sexual activities. According to financial records preserved in the archives of Castile, the king spent enormous sums on this residence, importing luxurious furnishings, exotic perfumes, and specialized equipment, whose purpose was described only obliquely in the official accounts as devices for the king's private recreation. A Genoese merchant who visited Seville during this period left a rare eyewitness description of the facility. In the southern quarter of the city stands a palace where the king keeps many women of different races, Christians, Moors, and even Jewesses, against their religion's law. These unfortunate creatures are guarded by black eunuchs imported from Africa at great expense, and none may leave once they enter that place. It is said by those who serve in the palace that the king visits this house 3 times each week, where he engages in practices so unnatural that I dare not commit them to writing. The records of the royal household indicate that women were brought to these pleasure houses from throughout the kingdom and beyond, often as gifts from nobles seeking royal favor or as tribute from conquered territories. Particularly prized were virgin girls from noble families who had opposed Sancho's usurpation, their sexual subjugation serving as both personal gratification for the king and political humiliation for their families. Bookmark was 9JQF tendencies. What distinguished Sancho from merely promiscuous medieval monarchs was his well-documented sadism. Multiple contemporary sources attest to the king's arousal from inflicting pain, a tendency that manifested both in his approach to justice and in his private sexual conduct. The Chronicle of Joffre de Loaisa, a relatively neutral account written shortly after Sancho's death, states that the king derived pleasure from the suffering of others, whether enemies in war or women in his bed. He would often have prisoners tortured in his presence, showing the same expression of satisfaction that other men display in the marriage bed. More explicit are references in private correspondence between Castilian nobles of the period. A letter from the Count of Haro to a relative, preserved in the family archives, warns, "Take care that no woman of your household comes to the king's attention. For those who have served his pleasure return broken in body and spirit, if they return at all. His appetites are not those of a natural man, but of a demon who delights in tears and blood." Particularly disturbing are accounts of Sancho's treatment of Muslim women captured during his campaigns against the remaining Moorish territories in southern Spain. According to both Christian and Muslim sources, the king personally selected the most beautiful captives for his pleasure houses, where they were forced to participate in elaborate scenarios of domination and humiliation that mocked their religious practices and cultural traditions. A Muslim chronicler from Granada wrote that the Christian king takes particular pleasure in forcing daughters of noble Muslim families to violate their own religious laws, compelling them to consume pork and wine before using their bodies in ways that would shame even the most hardened sinner. Those who resist suffer torments until they yield or die. Royal warrior. Another aspect of Sancho's sexuality that emerges from contemporary accounts was his voyeuristic tendency. Not content merely to participate in sexual acts himself, the king apparently derived significant pleasure from watching others, often in scenarios he carefully arranged for maximum psychological impact. The royal accounts show regular payments to what were euphemistically called performers, who would engage in sexual acts while the king observed. More disturbing are references to forced performances, where prisoners, captives, or servants would be compelled to participate in sexual scenarios against their will, often with family members or individuals with whom intimate contact was taboo under medieval religious and social norms. A document from the Ecclesiastical Court of Toledo references a case where a priest sought absolution after being forced to participate in unnatural acts at the command of the king, who observed from behind a screen while drinking wine and commenting on the proceedings as though watching a tournament or bear baiting. Perhaps the most extreme example of this voyeuristic tendency occurred following Sancho's suppression of a noble rebellion in 1286. According to multiple chronicles, the king had several captured rebel nobles brought to his pleasure house in Seville, where they were forced to watch as their wives and daughters were sexually abused by the king's guardsmen. Sancho reportedly observed these proceedings from an elevated gallery, laughing and clapping as though at a minstrel's performance, before personally participating in the violations. Bookmark 4G04M, The Dungeon of Jerez. The darkest aspects of Sancho's sexuality centered around a facility contemporary sources referred to as the Dungeon of Jerez, a section of the castle in that city, that the king had specially modified to indulge his most extreme tendencies. Unlike the pleasure houses, which at least maintained a facade of luxury and sensuality, the dungeon was explicitly designed for the combination of imprisonment, torture, and sexual exploitation that particularly aroused the king. Financial records from Sancho's reign include expenditures for the construction of specialized chambers within this facility, including rooms lined with mirrors, an expensive luxury in medieval Spain, devices described cryptically as iron maidens for the king's pleasure, and a drainage system whose purpose becomes clear in the more explicit accounts of activities conducted there. A Franciscan friar who served briefly as chaplain at Jerez Castle left a detailed description of the facility in a letter to his superior, explaining his request for reassignment. Below the eastern tower lies a suite of chambers that the king visits in secret when he stays at the castle. These rooms contain devices of torture such as I have never seen, not intended for the extraction of confession, but for the infliction of specific pains that His Majesty watches with unnatural attention. There are women kept in these chambers, changed frequently when they become too injured for the king's purposes, or when they die from his attentions. This account aligns with references in the Chronicle of Geoffrey de Loaisa to the king's habit of visiting Jerez with a small company of his most trusted guardsmen, returning after several days with his humors settled and his mind clear for matters of state. The chronicler, writing for a public audience, discreetly avoids specifying what occurred during these visits, but the implication is clear when this passage is read alongside other contemporary sources. Bookmark ED2D0PK Political Consequences. Sancho's sexual excesses had significant political repercussions beyond the obvious moral considerations. The enormous expense of maintaining his pleasure houses and specialized sexual facilities drained the royal treasury, at a time when Castile faced serious military threats from both Muslim kingdoms to the south and Christian rivals to the east and west. More damaging was the alienation of important noble families whose female members had been victimized by the king. The Chronicle of Geoffrey de Loaisa notes that many great houses that had initially supported Don Sancho against his nephews turned against him after daughters or sisters who had been sent to court as ladies-in-waiting returned in disgrace, bearing marks of the king's cruelty on their bodies. This alienation contributed to the perpetual instability of Sancho's reign, which was marked by repeated noble rebellions and conspiracies. The king's infamous treatment of women became a rallying point for his enemies, who cited his sexual cruelty as evidence that he was unfit to rule. A significant claim in an era when a king's personal morality was considered directly relevant to his fitness for the throne. Even Sancho's staunchest allies found his sexual behavior problematic from a practical political standpoint. A letter from his chief minister, Don Lope de Haro, preserved in the royal archives, cautiously advises the king, "While your majesty's private pleasures are your own concern, I humbly suggest that certain activities reported from Jerez have become known to foreign envoys, creating difficulties in our negotiations with Aragon and France, where princesses are sought as brides for the royal infantes." Bookmark 5D7H Decline and Death. As Sancho aged, his sexual pathologies reportedly intensified, taking increasingly extreme forms that alarmed even his most hardened courtiers. Contemporary accounts suggest that in his final years, the king became fixated on sexual scenarios involving death and dying, a perversion that went beyond even the sadism of his earlier years. The royal physician's journals, partially preserved in the archives of Toledo, include cryptic references to treating women for injuries inflicted by the king that grew more severe over time. One entry from 1294, a year before Sancho's death, notes, "Called again to attend to the Moorish girl in the king's private chamber. Her condition beyond my skill to remedy. She died at Vespers, the 3rd this month. His Majesty requires stronger remedies to achieve his satisfaction than in previous years." More explicit is an account in a private letter written by a Castilian nobleman to his brother in Aragon. It is whispered among those close to the court that the king now only finds release in the moment of his partner's death, strangling them with his own hands at the climax of the act. The bodies are removed in secret and buried in unconsecrated ground beyond the city walls. The king's confessor has refused him absolution, but he continues in these practices, saying that as king, he answers only to God. While such accounts may contain elements of exaggeration, they align with the trajectory of escalating violence documented throughout Sancho's reign, and with medical understanding of how sadistic tendencies can intensify over time when unconstrained by external limitations, a condition particularly likely in an absolute monarch whose power placed him beyond normal social and legal restraints. Sancho IV died in 1295 at the age of 36, after a brief illness that modern medical historians suggest may have been pneumonia or a respiratory infection. Given his age and previously robust health, rumors of poisoning immediately circulated, with suspicion falling on various parties, ranging from disgruntled nobles to the king's own courtiers, who had become horrified by his excesses. The Chronicle of Fernando IV, commissioned during his son's reign, offers the sanitized official account. King Sancho, fourth of that name, passed from this world after receiving the holy sacraments with proper devotion, mourned by his loyal subjects and by his virtuous queen, Doña Maria, who had been his faithful companion through many trials. This pious fiction contrasted sharply with private accounts that emerged after his death. A Dominican friar who claimed to have heard Sancho's final confession wrote to his superior that the king died unrepentant of his most grievous sins, claiming that as God's anointed on earth, he was entitled to use his subjects' bodies as he willed. I granted absolution only because he was at death's door, though I fear for his immortal soul. Historical legacy. The historical assessment of Sancho IV presents a complex challenge. As a ruler, he demonstrated considerable military skill, successfully defending Castile against multiple threats and even expanding its territory in some regions. His administrative reforms strengthened royal authority and improved the kingdom's fiscal management. In public, he presented himself as a defender of Christianity, patronizing religious institutions and leading campaigns against Muslim territories. Yet this public face of medieval Christian kingship stood in stark contrast to the private reality of sadistic sexual violence documented across multiple contemporary sources. The brutality he displayed toward women, particularly those from religious and ethnic minorities or from families that had opposed his rule, reveals how completely the power of medieval monarchy could corrupt an individual's sexuality, transforming it into an instrument of both personal gratification and political domination. What makes Sancho's case particularly significant for understanding medieval sexuality and power is not merely the extremity of his behavior, but the relative impunity with which he conducted it. Despite widespread knowledge of his activities among the nobility and clergy, no meaningful constraints were imposed on his conduct during his lifetime. This impunity illustrates the practical limitations of medieval Christianity's moral authority when confronted with the absolute power of kingship. In the final analysis, Sancho el Bravo exemplifies the darkest potential of unlimited royal power in the sexual realm. His reign demonstrates how the medieval institution of monarchy, lacking effective constitutional checks and supported by concepts of divine right, could enable sexual pathologies that would have been swiftly punished in any person of lesser status. In the dungeon of Jerez and the pleasure houses of Castile, we see the shadow side of medieval kingship in its most disturbing manifestation. A controversial inclusion. The inclusion of Philippa of Navarre in a chronicle of perverse medieval kings may initially seem puzzling or even historically inaccurate. No monarch by this name appears in the official royal genealogies of Navarre, and traditional historical accounts recognize no female ruler with this identity. Yet beneath the sanitized surface of official history lies a remarkable story of gender transgression, sexual nonconformity, and the malleability of medieval royal identity. A story pieced together from scattered references in chronicles, private correspondence, and ecclesiastical records. What emerges from these sources is an account of an individual born female, christened as Philippa, who lived and ruled as a man, taking a male title and engaging in sexual relationships with women. While modern categories of transgender identity would be anachronistic to apply to a medieval context, the evidence suggests that Philippa Philip represents a case of what medieval society would have categorized as female masculinity, or woman living as a man. A phenomenon documented in various contexts throughout the medieval period, though rarely at such elevated social levels. The controversy surrounding this figure explains the historical erasure that has relegated their story to fragmentary mentions and coded references, rather than the comprehensive chronicles devoted to more conventional rulers. Yet these fragments, when carefully assembled, reveal one of the most remarkable cases of sexual and gender nonconformity in medieval royal history. Bookmark WFMF, Birth and Early Years. The historical individual we are calling Philippa was born around 1270 as the second child of Henry I of Navarre and his wife Blanche of Artois. Official records list this child as female and provide the baptismal name of Philippa, after her maternal grandfather, Philip of France. Henry I died when Philippa was only 4 years old, leaving her elder sister Joanna as the nominal heir to the kingdom under the regency of their mother. The complex political situation that followed, including Blanche of Artois' flight to France with her daughters and her subsequent marriage to Edmund of Lancaster, created the conditions that would later allow for Philippa's remarkable transformation. According to several independent sources, including a letter from a Castilian diplomat to his king and entries in the chronicle of the monastery of Roncevaux, the young Philippa displayed a strong preference for masculine activities and dress from an early age. A lady-in-waiting to Blanche of Artois, in a deposition preserved in the archives of the Paris Parliament, recalled, "The younger princess refused female garments from the time she could speak, tearing off dresses and demanding to be clothed as her male cousins were. Her mother indulged this fancy in private while maintaining feminine appearance in public, believing the child would outgrow such notions." This fancy, however, only intensified as Philippa approached adolescence. When her sister Joanna was married to Philip IV of France in 1284, consolidating French control over Navarre, the 14-year-old Philippa was also brought to the French court, where contemporary accounts describe her as causing considerable disruption with her masculine behavior and appearance. Bookmark NQ 24CB, The Transformation. The pivotal moment in Philippa's transformation occurred around 1290, when she was approximately 20 years old. Following her sister Queen Joanna's death in childbirth, a succession crisis emerged regarding the governance of Navarre. while France maintained its claim to the territory through Joanna's infant son, the future Louis Tanks. A faction of Navarrese nobles sought greater independence from French control. It was at this juncture that Philippa appears to have fully embraced a male identity. According to a chronicle kept by a monk at the Abbey of Lair, the sister of the deceased queen, who had long dressed and conducted herself as a man in private, now declared to certain loyal nobles that she was in fact male, having been raised as female due to complex succession matters during her childhood. The chronicle continues, taking the name Philip and dressing entirely as a nobleman. This person gathered supporters among those who sought a Navarrese ruler rather than French governance. This extraordinary claim might be dismissed as political fiction were it not corroborated by other sources from the period. A letter from the Bishop of Pamplona to the Archbishop of Toledo, written in 1291, mentions with evident concern the individual who was born the daughter of King Henry and now claims to be his son, wearing men's clothing, bearing arms, and conducting himself in all ways as a prince rather than a princess. The Navarrese faction supporting Philip based their position on an ingenious legal argument that the child had been secretly male all along but presented as female during childhood to protect him from political enemies who might target a male heir. While historically implausible, this narrative provided a framework within which medieval society could accommodate what would otherwise have been an unacceptable gender transgression. Rule in the borderlands. While Philip IV of France maintained official control over Navarre, historical evidence suggests that Philip established effective rule over portions of the kingdom's borderlands between 1291 and 1307, particularly in the mountainous regions adjacent to Aragon, where French authority was weakest. Operating from the fortress of Estella, Philip, as we will now refer to this ruler, reflecting their chosen identity, created what amounted to a small breakaway state. The chronicles of the monastery of San Salvador de Ley record that the prince who was once called the Lady Philippa holds court at Estella, dispensing justice, receiving homage from certain nobles, and in all ways conducting the affairs of rulership. This account adds the significant detail that by his side stands a noble lady from Gascony, who is called his wife, though no children have come from this union. This reference to a wife is elaborated in other sources. A report from a Navarrese merchant to the King of Aragon mentions that the ruler at Estella keeps a household in the manner of a king, with a beautiful lady from Bayonne who shares his chamber and is accorded the honors of a queen, though the nature of their union is the subject of much private speculation. Most explicit is a letter from a papal legate to Rome, preserved in Vatican archives, expressing concern about the scandal in the Navarrese territories, where a woman born of royal blood now lives as a man, ruling certain districts, carrying weapons, and keeping another woman as her spouse in a perverted imitation of marriage that mocks the sacrament and natural law. Bookmark 31. Sexual practices and court life. Beyond the primary relationship with the wife from Gascony, identified in some sources as Lady Isabel de Grey, multiple accounts suggest that Philip maintained a court characterized by sexual nonconformity and gender experimentation that scandalized religious authorities while attracting individuals who did not fit within conventional medieval gender categories. A Dominican friar who visited Estella reported to his superiors that the court maintained by this person contains many who defy God's ordained order of creation. Men dress partially as women, women take the appearance and manners of men, and unnatural relations are conducted openly, without shame or concealment. More specific details emerge from legal proceedings conducted by ecclesiastical authorities in Pamplona against individuals associated with Philip's court. Testimony from these proceedings, preserved in fragmentary form, describes women at the court who, dressed as men, bore arms and engaged in martial exercises, and who shared beds with other women in the manner of husband and wife. The most detailed account of Philip's personal sexual practices comes from a handmaid previously employed in the household, who testified that the person who calls himself Prince Philip possesses artificial devices made of leather and wood, fashioned in the shape of the male member, which he uses upon the Lady Isabel and other women of the court in imitation of the natural act between man and woman. This reference to what modern scholars would recognize as dildos or other sexual implements is particularly significant, as it provides rare documentary evidence of such devices in medieval Europe. While archaeological findings have occasionally uncovered similar objects, contemporary written descriptions are extremely rare, making this testimony a valuable historical source for understanding medieval sexual practices outside heterosexual norms. Bookmark. Downfall and disappearance. Philip's remarkable experiment in gender nonconformity and autonomous rule came to an end around 1307, coinciding with Philip IV of France's consolidation of power following his destruction of the Knights Templar. French forces, according to the Chronicle of Saint-Denis, restored proper authority to the rebellious regions of Navarre, capturing the fortress at Estella after a brief siege. The fate of Philip and the court at Estella is recorded with frustrating incompleteness. Some sources suggest execution or imprisonment, while others indicate escape. The most detailed account comes from a merchant of Bayonne, who wrote to a business partner that the self-styled prince and several companions escaped the French forces by mountain paths known only to local shepherds, taking refuge in the kingdom of Aragon, where they live in obscurity under the protection of certain nobles sympathetic to their cause. Ecclesiastical records from the Diocese of Huesca in Aragon lend support to this account, noting the arrival in 1308 of certain persons from Navarre of unusual character, including one who claims noble birth and lives in a manner contrary to nature, having been born female yet living as male, keeping a female companion as spouse. The final documented reference to Philip appears in the testament of a minor Aragonese nobleman, dated 1316, which includes a bequest to the exiled Prince of Navarre and his lady, who have found shelter in my household these past years, and who, despite the irregularity of their circumstances, have conducted themselves with dignity and loyalty. After this date, the historical record falls silent on Philip's fate. The French monarchy and ecclesiastical authorities appear to have engaged in a deliberate effort to erase this episode from official histories, recategorizing Philip as the Princess Philippa in genealogies and chronicles, and attributing the disturbances in Navarre to conventional political rebellion, rather than the gender transgressive rule that contemporary sources clearly describe. Bookmark. Historical significance. The case of Philip of Navarre offers a remarkable window into the possibilities for gender transgression within medieval society, particularly at elite social levels where power and birth status could sometimes create space for behaviors that would have been severely punished among common people. While medieval theology and law contained strict prohibitions against cross-gender behavior and same-sex relationships, the practical application of these norms could be surprisingly flexible when political considerations intervened. Philip's story also illuminates the existence of communities and networks of gender non-conforming individuals in medieval Europe. The court at Estella, with its reported population of people defying conventional gender categories, suggests that such individuals could form supportive communities when circumstances permitted, creating spaces where alternative expressions of gender and sexuality could flourish, however temporarily. Perhaps most significantly, this obscured historical episode demonstrates the malleability of historical memory and the processes by which non-conforming individuals have been erased from official narratives. Had Philip succeeded in establishing more permanent rule, or had supporters maintained their version of events through written chronicles, this remarkable case of a female king might occupy a prominent place in medieval history, rather than existing primarily in fragmentary references and marginalized accounts. The story of Philippa Philip reminds us that medieval sexuality and gender contained far more complexity and diversity than conventional historical narratives have often acknowledged, and that the recovery of these hidden histories requires careful attention to scattered evidence that has survived despite systematic efforts at erasure. Bookmark LP Zap 2P. The Invalid Monarch. When Henry III of Castile ascended to the throne in 1390 at the age of 11, few expected him to survive to adulthood, much less develop the peculiar sexual proclivities that would later define his private life. Chronically ill from childhood, with what modern medical historians believe was some form of inflammatory bowel disease, Henry grew into a pale, thin young man whose physical weakness contrasted sharply with the medieval ideal of robust kingship. Contemporary descriptions of the king emphasize his sickly appearance. The chronicler Pero Lopez de Ayala wrote that the king was of medium height but excessively thin, with skin so pale it seemed almost transparent, showing the blue veins beneath. His eyes were large and watchful, missing nothing that occurred in his presence, though he himself participated little in the physical activities expected of a king. This physical fragility shaped Henry's sexuality in profound ways. Unable to engage in the normal sexual activities of a medieval monarch due to his chronic pain and weakness, Henry developed alternative means of satisfying his desires, primarily through elaborate voyeuristic arrangements that eventually became the defining feature of his private life. Bookmark 6M2. The Chambers of Observation. Henry's voyeuristic tendencies first emerged during his adolescence. According to several contemporary sources, the young king began to show an unusual interest in observing the private activities of others around the age of 15. A lady-in-waiting to Queen Catherine, in a letter preserved in the archives of the Mendoza family, noted with concern that His Majesty has developed a habit of hiding himself in certain chambers and closets of the palace, from which he watches the ladies at their toilette and in other private moments, without their knowledge or consent. As Henry reached adulthood and gained greater control over his environment, these voyeuristic tendencies evolved into elaborate architectural arrangements. The royal accounts from 1395 onward show substantial expenditures for the modification of several royal residences, particularly the Alcazar of Segovia and the palace at Toledo, to facilitate the king's observation of others without being seen himself. These modifications included what one builder's account described as concealed passages between the walls, with small openings covered by tapestries or wooden screens, through which one might observe the activities in chambers while remaining unseen. Other records mention the installation of false mirrors, likely polished metal, as glass mirrors were still rare and expensive in this period, positioned to allow observation from adjacent rooms. Most elaborate was the system installed in the royal bedroom itself. According to a detailed inventory conducted after Henry's death, The king's private chamber contained a great bed enclosed by curtains on all sides, within which the king might rest while observing activities in the chamber through cleverly concealed openings in the drapery, thus participating in the appearance of intimate matters while remaining apart due to his infirmities. Bookmark or exonai forge, the arranged performances. As Henry's reign progressed, his voyeurism evolved beyond opportunistic observation into carefully arranged performances staged specifically for his viewing pleasure. The royal accounts contain numerous entries for payments to what were euphemistically called dancers, players, or entertainers, who performed in the king's private chambers. A Genoese merchant who supplied luxury goods to the Castilian court wrote in his business correspondence that the king requires beautiful young people, both men and women, who are brought to the palace for what are called private performances. These are not the usual dances or minstrel shows performed at court, but activities of a more intimate nature that take place in certain chambers where the king may observe unseen. More explicit is a letter from the Archbishop of Toledo to a fellow prelate, expressing concern about the scandalous entertainments arranged for the king's pleasure, where young men and women perform the marital act and other unnatural deeds, while His Majesty watches from behind screens or curtains. These shameful spectacles are justified by his courtiers as necessary for the king's health and humors, though they constitute grave sin for all involved. Historical evidence suggests that many of these performers were well-compensated professionals, essentially high-class prostitutes, brought to court specifically for these purposes. The royal accounts show substantial payments to certain individuals who returned repeatedly to perform, some receiving grants of land or other valuable considerations for their services. However, other contemporary sources indicate that not all participants were willing professionals. A nobleman's petition to the Cortes, the representative assembly, in 1401 obliquely referenced the disappearance of daughters of good families who are taken to court for the king's entertainments and return with their virtue compromised, if they return at all. While carefully avoiding direct accusation of the king, the petition requested greater protection for young women traveling to and from the royal court. Bookmark 3XSM5 at the Queen's complicity. One of the most remarkable aspects of Henry III's voyeuristic arrangements was the apparent complicity of his wife, Queen Catherine of Lancaster. Far from opposing her husband's unusual sexual practices, contemporary accounts suggest that the Queen actively facilitated them, even participating in some aspects of the arrangements. The Chronicle of Alvar Garcia de Santa Maria notes that the Queen, understanding her husband's infirmities, prevented normal marital relations, showed great patience and wisdom in accommodating his unusual needs, thereby maintaining harmony in the royal household, despite circumstances that might have caused discord in a less prudent woman. This diplomatic phrasing obscures the more explicit details found in private correspondence of the period. A lady-in-waiting, writing to her sister, reported that the Queen herself selects certain ladies who come newly to court, judging their suitability for the private entertainments that please the king. Those she finds most beautiful and graceful are assigned chambers near the concealed passages, with instructions to leave candles burning and curtains arranged in particular ways at certain hours. Even more directly involved was the Queen's cousin, Lady Juana de Mendoza, who according to multiple sources served as the primary organizer of the sexual performances staged for the king's observation. Royal accounts show substantial payments to Lady Juana for unspecified services, while contemporary letters refer to her as the mistress of the king's pleasures and the arranger of private entertainments. The Queen's tolerance and facilitation of these arrangements likely stemmed from practical political considerations, as well as personal adaptability. As a foreign-born consort in a complex and faction-ridden court, Catherine's primary duty was to provide legitimate heirs and maintain stability. By accommodating her husband's sexual peculiarities rather than opposing them, she maintained her position of influence and avoided creating opportunities for rival factions to exploit discord in the royal marriage. Bookmark: from observation to direction. As Henry's reign continued, his voyeuristic practices evolved in complexity. No longer content merely to observe spontaneous or loosely scripted sexual encounters, the king began to direct elaborate scenarios with specific themes, costumes, and activities, essentially becoming a director of erotic performances designed for his exclusive viewing. Court accounts from the period 1403 to 1406 include expenditures for specialized furniture, props, and costumes used in these performances. Particularly notable are references to Moorish arrangements, scenes from antiquity, and tableau of the 7 deadly sins, suggesting themed performances that combined historical or religious narratives with sexual content. A Florentine diplomat, in a confidential report to his government, described one such performance he had learned about from a court insider. The king had ordered a reenactment of the seraglio of the Sultan, with women dressed in the Eastern manner being presented to a man playing the Grand Turk. What followed was a demonstration of various acts believed to be practiced in the harems of the infidel, performed while the king observed from behind a gilded screen, occasionally sending messages with changes he wished to see in the proceedings. By this stage of his reign, Henry had assembled a permanent troupe of performers who lived in designated quarters within the royal palaces and were bound to secrecy about their activities. Royal accounts show these individuals received regular stipends, fine clothing, and eventually grants of land or titles, compensation that reflected both the value the king placed on their services and the importance of ensuring their discretion. Medical justifications and religious complications. A fascinating aspect of Henry III's sexual arrangements was the medical justification developed to legitimize them. Medieval medicine, based on the theory of humors, held that regular sexual release was necessary for male health. For a king whose physical condition prevented conventional sexual activity, alternative arrangements could be medically justified as necessary for maintaining his health and, by extension, the stability of the realm. The royal physician, Master Geronimo, left a remarkable document in which he argued that the king's observation of natural acts between others serves to balance his humors and strengthen his vital spirits, even when his bodily weakness prevents his own participation. This practice is therefore not mere lasciviousness, but a necessary treatment for His Majesty's continued governance and health. This medical justification helped to manage the religious complications of the king's voyeuristic practices. While the Catholic Church condemned both fornication and voyeurism as sins, the king's confessor, a Dominican friar named Pedro de Villacañas, apparently developed a theological argument that partially absolved Henry of guilt for his unusual arrangements. A treatise attributed to Friar Pedro, which survives in a single manuscript in the Library of Salamanca, argues that a king's body is not merely his own but belongs to the kingdom, and its maintenance is therefore a matter of state rather than merely personal morality. What would be sin in a common man may, in the extraordinary circumstance of royal necessity, be tolerated as the lesser evil when compared to the harm that would come from a king's incapacity or death. While this argument would have found little support in mainstream Catholic theology of the period, it provided a veneer of religious legitimacy that allowed court clerics to tolerate the king's behavior without openly challenging ecclesiastical authority. Bookmark: Political consequences. Henry III's unusual sexual practices had significant political ramifications beyond the expected moral concerns. The most immediate impact was on patterns of favor and advancement at court, where those who facilitated the king's voyeuristic activities gained influence that often exceeded their formal positions. The royal accounts show that individuals involved in arranging the king's entertainments received substantial rewards. Lady Juana de Mendoza, the primary organizer, saw her family's fortunes rise dramatically during Henry's reign, with her husband appointed to key military commands and her children married into leading noble families. Similarly, nobles who provided attractive young people for the court performances gained favorable judgments in property disputes, tax exemptions, and other valuable considerations. More broadly, Henry's physical limitations and unusual private life created governance patterns that differed from typical medieval kingship. Unable to lead armies personally or engage in the physical aspects of chivalric kingship, Henry developed alternative methods of rule that emphasized bureaucracy, delegation, and careful observation, approaches that actually strengthened royal authority in some respects. The chronicler Garcia de Santa Maria noted that, though weak in body, the king was sharp of mind and missed nothing that occurred in his realm, having developed the habit of watching and listening without being seen, so that many were surprised by his knowledge of matters they believed hidden from royal awareness. This observational approach to governance, while initially developed to accommodate the king's physical limitations and voyeuristic tendencies, contributed to administrative innovations that outlasted Henry's reign and influenced the development of more modern governance structures in later Castilian history. Bookmark: UK BNPC2 NFMO, Legacy and Historical Assessment. Henry III died in 1406 at the age of 27, having ruled personally for just over a decade. Despite his physical frailty and unconventional private life, historical assessments of his reign have been largely positive. He stabilized a kingdom that had been torn by factional conflict during his minority, reformed the royal finances, and strengthened Castilian diplomatic position relative to neighboring powers. The chronicler Fernán Pérez de Guzmán, writing a generation after Henry's death, provided a carefully balanced assessment. Though afflicted with constant illness that prevented him from performing many kingly duties in the traditional manner, Henry showed great wisdom in governance, keeping the nobles in check and the treasury full. If his private habits were unusual, they remained private and did not corrupt his public judgments or the administration of justice. This historical rehabilitation partially reflects the success of efforts to separate the king's private sexual behavior from his public role, a separation facilitated by the literally hidden nature of his voyeurism. Unlike monarchs whose sexual excesses were publicly visible or directly affected matters of state, Henry conducted his unusual activities behind walls and screens, allowing chroniclers and historians to focus on his public achievements rather than his private perversions. In a broader sense, Henry III's story illustrates how medieval monarchs could adapt sexual expression to accommodate physical limitations, creating alternative arrangements that, while transgressive by contemporary moral standards, allowed for the continuation of royal authority and dynastic succession. His voyeuristic practices, developed in response to chronic illness, represent a unique case study in the relationship between physical disability, sexual adaptation, and royal power in medieval Europe. Bookmark 5. Between Two Worlds. When Alfonso VI ascended to the throne of Leon in 1065, and later added Castile to his domains, he ruled over a frontier kingdom where Christian and Islamic civilizations met, clashed, and occasionally blended. This cultural borderland shaped Alfonso's approach to kingship, warfare, religion, and perhaps most notably, his sexual practices, which scandalized Christian Europe while reflecting the influence of the Muslim societies with which he regularly interacted. Contemporary chronicles describe Alfonso as tall and physically imposing, with a thick beard and penetrating gaze that commanded respect. The Muslim chronicler Ibn Bassam, who was no friend to Christian rulers, nevertheless acknowledged that the tyrant Alfonso was a man of great presence, whose mere appearance could silence dissent among his followers, and whose appetites in war, food, and women were equally immense. This reference to Alfonso's appetites was no mere rhetorical flourish. Historical evidence from Christian, Muslim, and Jewish sources confirms that the king maintained sexual arrangements more typical of an Islamic sultan than a Christian monarch, including what amounted to a royal harem comprising women from diverse religious and ethnic backgrounds. Bookmark score M5 fo Deef Dave, the King's Collection. The most distinctive aspect of Alfonso's sexual behavior was his maintenance of what contemporary sources called his collection of women, a group of concubines who lived in dedicated quarters within the royal palaces at Leon, Burgos, and Toledo. Unlike most Christian kings of the period, who typically maintained a single official mistress alongside their queen, Alfonso established an arrangement that explicitly mimicked the harems of the Muslim rulers he both fought against and emulated. The Chronicle of Sahagun, written by a monk with direct knowledge of the royal court, notes with evident disapproval that the king, having spent time among the Moors during his exile, brought back to his Christian kingdoms certain customs contrary to our faith, keeping many women in a manner similar to the Muslim princes, some as wives according to different laws, others as concubines without any legal standing. This reference to Alfonso's exile provides important context for understanding his unusual sexual arrangements. Before becoming king, Alfonso had spent time in the court of Al-Mamun, the Muslim ruler of Toledo, where he observed Islamic royal customs firsthand. Upon gaining the throne, he appears to have adapted aspects of these customs to his own purposes, despite their contradiction of Christian sexual morality. Royal financial records confirm the extraordinary scale of Alfonso's collection. Accounts from the years 1080 to 1085 show dedicated expenditures for the maintenance of the king's ladies, including separate household staff, luxurious accommodations, and specialized food and clothing. One inventory lists apartments for 27 women of various backgrounds, each with her own servants and allowance proportionate to her status in the king's favor. Bookmark Oion from Three Faiths. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Alfonso's harem was its religious and ethnic diversity. Historical sources confirm that the king maintained simultaneous sexual relationships with Christian, Muslim, and Jewish women, an arrangement that reflected the multicultural nature of his kingdoms, but violated religious boundaries that medieval society considered sacred. The Chronicle of Bishop Pelayo of Oviedo states that the king kept women of all three faiths in his private chambers, showing no preference for Christians over Moors or Jewesses in his carnal relations, though he remained outwardly devoted to the church and its teachings. This religious diversity was no accident, but a deliberate policy that served both personal and political purposes. By maintaining intimate relationships with women from all three religious communities in his realms, Alfonso created personal connections to each group, gaining intelligence, cultural insights, and diplomatic advantages that proved valuable in governing his diverse territories. Most famous among Alfonso's Muslim concubines was Zaida, a princess of the Muslim kingdom of Seville, who came to Alfonso's court around 1091. Though the exact circumstances of her arrival remain debated by historians, contemporary sources agree that she became one of the king's favorite companions, eventually converting to Christianity and bearing him his only son, Sancho, who died before his father. The Chronicle of Najera records that the Moorish princess Zaida came to the king's court and pleased him greatly with her beauty and learning, so that he kept her always near him, even when campaigning, and trusted her counsel in many matters, particularly those concerning relations with the Muslim kingdoms. Jewish women in Alfonso's entourage included daughters of prominent Sephardic families from Toledo and other cities with significant Jewish populations. These relationships facilitated Alfonso's governance of Jewish communities and gave him access to the financial and commercial networks controlled by elite Jewish families, connections that proved valuable in funding his military campaigns and administrative reforms. Arranged observations and competitions. Alfonso's sexual activities went beyond merely maintaining a large number of concubines from diverse backgrounds. Multiple contemporary sources describe elaborate arrangements within the royal harem, including competitive sexual performances and ritualized observations that combined elements of Christian courtly love, Islamic harem traditions, and the king's personal preferences. A particularly detailed account comes from Abraham ibn Ezra, a Jewish scholar who served briefly at Alfonso's court before departing for Muslim territories. In a private letter discovered in the Cairo Geniza, Ibn Ezra described the king's unusual practices. The Christian ruler arranges his women in circles according to his favor toward them, having them perform dances and songs for his pleasure. Then he selects those who most please him that day for private entertainment, sometimes watching as they engage with each other in ways that would shame even the most worldly observer. This account aligns with hints in Christian sources about competitive performances among the king's concubines. The Chronicle of Sahagun refers obliquely to pagan revels within the royal chambers, where women compete for the king's attention through displays that virtuous Christians would not describe nor witness. These competitive performances apparently extended to sexual activities conducted for the king's observation and pleasure. A Cluniac monk who visited the Lyonese court wrote to his abbot that the king's private life contains elements so contrary to Christian teaching that I hesitate to commit them to writing, even in Latin. Suffice to say that women of different faiths are made to perform together in ways that combine the worst excesses of pagan Rome with practices imported from the harems of the East. Bookmark. Du Waf L. File X. Political marriages and personal pleasure. Alongside his extensive harem, Alfonso contracted 5 official marriages during his reign, an extraordinary number by medieval standards, where monarchs typically remarried only after being widowed. These marriages served clear political purposes, creating alliances with important neighboring powers, but they existed in an uneasy relationship with the king's collection of concubines. Alfonso's first 2 wives, Agnes of Aquitaine and Constance of Burgundy, came from powerful French noble houses connected to the influential monastery of Cluny, which was instrumental in bringing Spanish Christianity into closer alignment with Roman practices. His later marriages to Bertha, possibly from Tuscany, Isabel, of disputed origin, and Beatrice of France, similarly served diplomatic purposes. What made these marriages unusual was not their political nature. Most royal marriages were primarily political arrangements, but their relationship to Alfonso's continuing harem arrangements. Unlike most Christian kings, who at least maintained the appearance of monogamy after marriage, Alfonso openly continued his relationships with numerous concubines regardless of his marital status. The Chronicle of Bishop Pelayo notes with evident disapproval that, even when properly married to Christian queens of noble birth, the king did not set aside his concubines as the church requires, but kept all his women together, to the great scandal of his legitimate wives and the court. This arrangement created considerable tension, particularly with Alfonso's second wife, Constance of Burgundy, who came from a deeply religious background and found the harem arrangement offensive to her faith and dignity. Contemporary accounts suggest that Queen Constance attempted to use her influence with the Cluniac monks to pressure Alfonso into abandoning his concubines, but with limited success. A letter from Abbot Hugh of Cluny to Alfonso, preserved in monastic archives, delicately addresses this issue. "We have heard from our devout daughter, your queen, that certain arrangements in your household cause her great distress and may imperil your soul. We urge your majesty to consider whether practices adopted from non-Christian peoples are suitable for a king who bears the title of Defender of the Faith." Bookmark 9c. The Toledo Pleasure Palace. After conquering the former Muslim capital of Toledo in 1085, Alfonso established what contemporary sources described as a pleasure palace within the city's Alcazar. This facility, designed explicitly for the king's sexual activities, represented the fullest expression of his adaptation of Islamic royal practices to Christian kingship. The Chronicle of Sahagun refers to chambers within the Toledan fortress arranged in the Moorish fashion, with fountains, gardens, and private apartments where the king keeps women of various nations and faiths for his pleasure. This description aligns with archaeological evidence from the Toledo Alcazar, which shows modifications to create the secluded, garden-centered living spaces typical of Islamic elite women's quarters. Royal financial records provide additional details about this facility, including expenditures for Moorish craftsmen to construct baths and fountains in the private chambers, silken hangings and cushions for the women's apartments, and musicians skilled in the songs of both Christians and Moors to perform for the king's ladies. Most explicit is a letter from a Mozarabic priest, Christians living under Muslim rule who maintained their faith, to the Archbishop of Toledo, expressing concern about activities within the Alcazar. The king has established within the city a house of pleasure modeled on those of the Muslim princes, where women dance unclothed in the inner courtyards and perform acts together that cannot be named without sin. These activities occur with the knowledge and participation of certain nobles who have adopted the corrupt practices of the infidels. Bookmark 6wm. Religious Reactions and Justifications. Alfonso's sexual practices placed him in a complex relationship with the church. As a Christian king responsible for expanding Christian territory at the expense of Islamic states, he enjoyed considerable prestige and support from ecclesiastical authorities. Yet his personal conduct violated fundamental Christian sexual norms, creating tensions that required careful management. The king appears to have addressed these tensions through a combination of generous religious patronage and the development of theoretical justifications for his behavior. His lavish support for the monastery of Sahagun, substantial donations to the Cathedral of Santiago de Compostela, and introduction of the Roman liturgy to his kingdoms, all served to cement his image as a defender of the faith despite his personal transgressions. More interesting are the justifications developed within Alfonso's court for his harem arrangements. treatise attributed to Cisnando Davides, a Mozarabic advisor who had lived in both Christian and Muslim societies, argued that the king's position on the frontier between faiths requires him to understand and adapt practices from both worlds to govern effectively. As Solomon kept wives from many nations to better rule his diverse kingdom, so too must King Alfonso maintain relationships with women of different faiths to ensure harmony within his realms. This pragmatic political justification was supplemented by medical arguments similar to those used by other medieval monarchs to excuse sexual excess. The royal physician, trained in the advanced medical traditions of Islamic Iberia, reportedly advised that the king's robust physical nature requires more frequent release of humors than ordinary men, necessitating multiple partners to maintain his health and vigor for the demanding tasks of warfare and governance. While these justifications convinced few serious churchmen, they provided intellectual cover for Alfonso's behavior and allowed his supporters to present his sexual arrangements as matters of state necessity rather than mere personal indulgence. Bookmark Legacy and historical significance. Alfonso VI died in 1109 after a reign of nearly 45 years that transformed the political landscape of medieval Iberia. Despite his sexual excesses, his historical reputation has remained largely positive, focusing on his military achievements, administrative reforms, and role in the Reconquista, the centuries-long Christian reconquest of the Iberian Peninsula from Muslim rule. The king's unusual sexual arrangements have been treated as a colorful footnote in most historical accounts, often attributed simply to Moorish influence, without deeper analysis of their political and cultural significance. Yet Alfonso's adaptation of Islamic harem practices to Christian kingship represents a fascinating case study in cross-cultural exchange at the most intimate level of governance. By maintaining simultaneous sexual relationships with Christian, Muslim, and Jewish women within an organized harem structure, Alfonso created a microcosm of the multicultural society he ruled. These arrangements not only satisfied his evident sexual appetites, but also provided practical advantages in governing diverse populations, gathering intelligence, and navigating the complex cultural landscape of medieval Iberia. In a broader sense, Alfonso's sexual practices illustrate the malleability of supposedly rigid religious and cultural boundaries in frontier societies. While Christian sexual ideology officially condemned polygamy and concubinage, the practical realities of governing a multicultural kingdom created spaces where alternative arrangements could be maintained, albeit with tension and controversy. The harem king of Leon and Castile thus stands as a remarkable example of how medieval monarchs could adapt sexual practices across cultural boundaries, creating hybrid arrangements that reflected both personal desires and political necessities in ways that defied simple categorization within any single religious or cultural tradition. Bookmark: Patterns of Royal Perversion. As we conclude our exploration of medieval monarchies' darkest sexual secrets, certain patterns emerge across the diverse cases we have examined. From Charlemagne's alleged incest to Alfonso VI's multicultural harem, from William Rufus's homosexual court to Sancho Ford's sadistic chambers, these royal sexual histories reveal common themes about the relationship between power, sexuality, and governance in the medieval world. First, we observe that unlimited power created unlimited opportunity for sexual expression, both in terms of quantity and variety of sexual partners and activities. Freed from the constraints that limited ordinary people, medieval monarchs could indulge desires that would have been severely punished in those of lesser status. The king, who could command armies, distribute lands, and order executions, could similarly command bodies for sexual purposes, creating arrangements that satisfied even the most unusual appetites. Second, we see that sexual behavior frequently aligned with broader patterns of government. Cruel kings like Pedro III and Sancho IV expressed their sadistic tendencies both in matters of state and in their bedchambers. Rulers known for innovation or cultural borrowing, like Alfonso VI, often showed similar creativity and cross-cultural adaptation in their sexual arrangements. The sexuality of medieval monarchs was rarely divorced from their overall approach to power and authority. Third, these histories demonstrate the surprising adaptability of medieval institutions and ideologies when confronted with royal sexual transgression. Despite clear religious prohibitions against behaviors like incest, homosexuality, sadism, or maintaining multiple sexual partners, the practical institutions of church and state found ways to accommodate royal perversions through medical justifications, theological exceptions, or simply discreet silence. The king's body, understood as in some sense sacred and essential to the realm's welfare, received exemptions from normal moral constraints in ways that reflected the unique position of monarchy in medieval political theology. Book. Beyond modern categories. One striking aspect of these royal sexual histories is how poorly they fit within modern categories of sexual identity or orientation. Medieval monarchs like William Rufus or Philip of Navarre cannot be simply labeled as homosexual or transgender in the modern sense, as their behaviors existed within entirely different conceptual frameworks of gender, sexuality, and power. For medieval people, sexual acts were categorized primarily by their relationship to procreation and natural order, rather than by the genders of the participants. Kings who engaged in same-sex activities were condemned not for homosexuality as an identity, but for acts against nature that subverted divine design. Similarly, cross-gender behavior, like Philippa Phillips, was understood through frameworks of disguise, deception, or divine exception, rather than personal gender identity. The sexual perversions of medieval kings remind us that human sexuality has always been complex and varied, but the conceptual frameworks used to understand and regulate it have changed dramatically over time. By examining these historical cases on their own terms, rather than imposing anachronistic categories, we gain a richer understanding of how sexuality functioned within medieval systems of power and meaning. Bookmark. SF4Z, the double-edged sword of royal sexuality. Perhaps the most significant insight from these royal sexual histories is the paradoxical relationship between sexual excess and royal authority. On one hand, unusual or excessive sexual behavior could undermine a king's legitimacy by contradicting Christian moral norms and damaging their image as God's representative on earth. Chronicles are filled with moralistic observations, connecting royal sexual sin to divine punishment, dynastic failure, or political disaster. On the other hand, spectacular sexual transgression could sometimes reinforce royal exceptionalism, emphasizing the king's position above ordinary constraints and rules. The very excess that scandalized contemporaries also demonstrated the monarch's special status and power. A king who could openly maintain dozens of concubines, engage in incest, or practice sadism without consequence visibly manifested the unlimited nature of royal authority in ways that both disturbed and impressed his subjects. This paradox explains why medieval societies simultaneously condemned royal sexual excess in moral terms, while accommodating and even facilitating it in practice. The king's sexual transgressions were both a danger to his authority and an expression of it, a double-edged sword that could both legitimize and undermine the institution of monarchy itself. Bookmark. Historical truth and historical narrative. As we conclude this exploration, it is important to acknowledge the challenges of historical certainty when dealing with medieval sexuality, particularly the sexuality of powerful individuals whose reputations were political battlegrounds. Many of the accounts we have examined come from hostile chroniclers, political enemies, or religious authorities with clear agendas. Others have been filtered through centuries of retelling, embellishment, and moralization. Yet the consistency of certain accounts across multiple sources, the specificity of details provided by contemporary witnesses, and the alignment of these narratives with what we know about medieval power structures all suggest that these stories, while perhaps exaggerated in some particulars, contain substantial historical truth. The perversions of medieval kings were not merely propaganda inventions, but real expressions of how unlimited power could manifest in the sexual realm. By examining these royal sexual histories with both critical skepticism and careful contextual understanding, we gain valuable insights into the nature of medieval monarchy, an institution that placed extraordinary power in the hands of individuals whose personal conduct could range from the exemplary to the monstrous, sometimes within the same reign. The human behind the crown. Finally, these sexual histories remind us that beneath the crown and behind the throne sat human beings, individuals with desires, appetites, and psychologies shaped by their unique circumstances. The sacred office of kingship did not transform these men, and occasionally women, into perfect moral exemplars. Rather, it often amplified their existing tendencies by removing the constraints that limit ordinary human behavior. In the perversions of medieval kings, we see not just historical curiosities, but profound truths about human nature when freed from normal boundaries. Some rulers used this freedom to express sadistic tendencies that might have remained checked in persons of lesser status. Others found space to explore gender expressions or sexual practices that defied the norms of their societies. Still others simply indulged appetites for sexual variety and excess that most people could only imagine. These deeply human stories, with all their complexity, contradiction, and occasional horror, remind us that history is not merely a record of institutions, battles, and policies, but of people. People whose most intimate behaviors could shape kingdoms, influence policies, and sometimes change the course of history itself. In exploring the bedchambers of medieval royalty, we have gained not only a more complete picture of medieval monarchy, but a deeper understanding of the complex relationship between power, sexuality, and human nature that continues to shape our world today.